So why don't we take a second to just look at what sort of example you have here. We can address that and just make sure that we're all on the same page.
Oh, you want me to find examples?
You have a specific question?
No, I just didn't understand the difference between, I mean, even though I understand like the HTML part, but it just wasn't clear what the difference between the log and the dir was.
Okay, so console.log is going to give you a line output. The console.dir is a different formatting of the output. So what I'd recommend is taking different inputs into the console method and then using the resources from W3 School. So everyone has access to the slides. Are you guys using those slides? So if we can go to that specific section of the slides when we get to it, we can take a look at that example this evening and just make sure that we go over that thoroughly. Yeah. Other than that, the main things that we want to make sure that we're familiar with are the JavaScript console.log method, the debugger keyword, the document object model. So I would imagine that you all have that model drawn out in your notes so you can understand how the HTML is structured. And the other thing is understanding the window object, which represents an open window in the browser. Because off the window object, we can get to the document object, and then from the document object, we can get to all those nodes which are within that element. So an example would be document.getElements by tag name. Right? That's an example of getting elements by their tag name and allows us to manipulate the objects that are returned from that. The specific methods associated with the document are going to be document.all, which is deprecated, document.head, document.body, document.getElementById, and document.getElements by class name, document.querySelector, document.querySelector all, and then apart from that, we have the difference between child nodes and children. So the child nodes returns a child node, and that includes element nodes, text nodes, and comment nodes. Children returns child elements. So they're not text and they're not comment nodes. That's the key difference there, right? Yeah, and then from that we have the ability to append children, we have the ability to create text nodes, we have the ability to get parent elements, we have the ability to change the parent node, the child nodes, all those things in the DOM. So we go ahead and get started here, and I'll share our slides. So back into JavaScript, right? The daily law. Over time, masters gain an intuitive feel for the whole of their field. It's excitement and joy that awaits you if you are patient. Let's do a quick sprint review. So, coming up, the questions that we have in week 5 sprint. We want to know what are regular expressions, how do we use Json. We can look at our board here. We'll go ahead and click start sprint. Got quite a few questions answered here already. Let's take a look and see what's been done. So Jorge's gone through and added an explanation of what scope is. Very good. He's got a graphical representation here, an example of that function scope. So this is a way for us to be able to differentiate between the local and global scope of a method, and that scopes can be nested. So this is a block scope. This is really important to read through. This is very thorough and in-depth. This is exactly why we have these questions, in our sprint. Right? This shows the block scope of the function, and then within here is the scope of the conditional. So there's a difference. The variables used within these curly braces are not the same scope as the variables used outside of the curly braces. And likewise, outside of the function is another scope. We call that global scope. That's where the run method is being called. Awesome job, Jorge. This looks really good. Let's go ahead and grab that one. And then how do we use conditional statements? Right? We can use conditional statements to make decisions in our code. It's a way for us to explain choices. It's a way for us to differentiate between different paths in our code, right? So here's the if statement, the else statement, and the else if statement. And the way that works is to simply say, if the time is less than 10, then display good morning. Otherwise, if the time is less than 20, display good day. Finally, if none of these conditions are met, then display good evening. Awesome job. So what is the purpose of scope? Storing values in variables is a fundamental concept in programming. A variable's scope determines when it is and isn't available throughout your program. Understanding variable scope in JavaScript is one of the keys in building a solid foundational language. Nice job. And here we have an example of how to debug your code in JavaScript. So let's take a look at these screenshots here. Jorge, do you want to give us a rundown of what you have put here? If you give me an order, I'll go through them.
They're in the description.
Okay. Do you want to just give us an explanation? This is fantastic work.
Screen merger. So within the different types of debuggers, the ways that you can kind of access them, it kind of explains how you're able to kind of debug like this one's based off of functionality that you kind of want to see for each time that it's called. It's been inspected and where it's located. So you can see that in the explanation in the body. It kind of addresses cross-reference as to what it looks like before you start to debug it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so here we have console.time, which sets a timer, and then after you run it, it tells you the time it's ended, so it tells you that this for loop has elapsed 15 milliseconds. This is very important when you're running your code because you want to be able to make sure that your code is running properly. So these timing methods might be used in a method to figure out which method is more preferable, which method is better used for a specific task. Here's how you can access the view for the code, the inspector that allows you to see what's going on, right? You can find specific elements in here. And this is another example of finding elements in the console. And then this is a way of printing out a table of elements, right? This prints out a table of an array, I'm guessing, or an object. Nice. So the document object model is an application programming interface, an API. An API is what allows us to interface with a programming language, which is running in the background of the program. So the API is really a drive-through. There's a menu, and then there's the actual code that's being run, which is the drive-through shop. So we can put in our specific order in that menu, and then that's connected to the drive-through, which processes the order, which is the actual program itself, right? And then how do we use the DOM? So the document object model is a programming interface that allows us to create, change, or remove elements from the document. This is very important. It allows us to add things to the document like in our to-do list. We could add an element and then we can remove the element just using JavaScript. Yolanda provided a really good example as well. Right? The DOM can be manipulated by selecting elements and traversing elements. Right? It's good. Nice. So what are JavaScript events? Yeah, so we can refer to these as JavaScript events. Right, the on change, on click, on mouse over, on mouse out, on key down, on load. These are all attributes that we can place on HTML. When we use the on click attribute, what we can do is we can assign that to a JavaScript function such that when a user clicks on that object, that HTML element, when the user clicks on the HTML element, it calls the function. Likewise, we can do that for on mouse over. When the user clicks on the element, that'll call the on click. If we hover over it with the mouse, that's a mouse over. It's also on key down, so the enter key is 13. That's a key press of 13. So when a user presses enter, we can create an element. Right? We can load elements as well. Okay. And then we have how do we use JavaScript events. So on-click event type. This is the most frequently used event type, which occurs when a user clicks the left button of his mouse. You can put your validation down, your warning against an event type, and then we also have the on-submit event type. The on-submit is an event that occurs when you try to submit a form. You can put your form validation against this event type. And we have on-mouse over and on-mouse out. These two event types will help you create nice effects with images or even with text as well. The on mouse over event triggers when you bring your mouse over an element. On the mouse out triggers when you move your mouse out from the element. So it's like there was supposed to be an example here which didn't get pulled in. This is just from W3. Yeah. So this is kind of an interesting event, right? We want to have something where we can mouse over something and then we can mouse over it, so when we come into the area of the element, that's when the action happens. And then we can also have another event where if you come into the area, nothing happens, but then if you move out of the area, then that's when there's a change. We haven't gotten to regular expressions. It's going to be a lot of trial and error. The most important aspect of a regular expression that I want everyone to understand is this wildcard. This is the most important thing that you need to know. It's a way for you to select everything. It's the most frequently used expression from my personal experience, right? And we can add different patterns by using the add sign, but most of this is going to be trial and error, and it typically starts with selecting everything with a wildcard. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to get into this. Good stuff. And then we have JSON. So JSON is the JavaScript object notation. We've already seen an example of a JavaScript object. JSON is a way for us to take the JavaScript object and encode it in a string so that we can send that data. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just send an object with a bunch of properties from one place on the internet to the other place on the internet? Well, that's what JSON allows us to do. A JSON object is a way for a user to send data from a server to a web page, and it's self-describing and easy to understand. Right? It has the key values and pairs that we need to use to send the data. So, nice job. Still have till the end of the week on this, so a lot of questions here to still be answered, and I encourage you to get in there and share your perspectives and learn from each other. All right, so I'll do a quick review, right? the more that we practice, the better we will get. So the more that you type JavaScript, the more examples that you go through, the easier it will be for you to remember, oh, this is how you invoke a function in JavaScript. Oh, this is how you use a for loop in JavaScript. It comes down to practice, right? Practicing it and reviewing it and going over it consistently. So, who can tell me what JavaScript debugging is?
It's a way of systematically going through your code to find any errors in it. So you can do it by breaking it down and seeing what the code is doing at certain points, or by like we've already done a lot with the console log to like see if function is even doing anything. You can put console log and then a message so that you can know that that function is being called on. But it's just a way of kind of systematically breaking it down so you can find any errors in it.
Right. So we have the console.log method, the debugger keyword, breakpoints, watch, and call stay. So who can tell me what the debugger keyword does without using what's in the slides?
You enter the word in the debugger into JavaScript, and it will notify you whether it's running or not. That's the way I understand it.
Okay. Look at this example. So the debugger keyword stops the execution of call of JavaScript and calls, if available, the debugging function. This has the same function as setting a breakpoint in the debugger. If no debugging is available, the debugger statement has no effect. With the debugger turned on, this code will stop executing before it executes the third line. So we can open up our debugger here. We'll do Command-Shift-D. Moves over to the side. Get rid of this. Yeah. We want to open up our settings so that we can actually see this. So, slide this over. So here we see that there aren't any breakpoints. Nothing's being read here. Now we can run this, right? And now it says paused in debugger. So we can use the step over next function, right? And this keeps us going. So this is a way for us to step through the code and debug it. Right? And click this and it goes all the way through. So we run it again. Here's where we're hitting the debugger. Right? The next thing we can do is step over it. It's going to go to this part of JavaScript, and we're looking at a variable of x. We can keep going through. Here's a bunch of other variables that we have. Okay. We know how many watch statements. We could add one in here. X. Run it. Go all the way through. Run the JavaScript again. Here's our watch. It says X is 75. Keep going. Keep going. Now we're out of that block of code, so that variable is no longer there. Okay? So we could run this again. We can modify our statement to be x plus x plus x. We run the code. And this will tell us what the statement is. So if we wanted to modify this, now we know if x plus x plus x equals 255, console.log, our code is working. All right, we can run this. Step over it, step over it, step over it. Look down here. So x plus x equals 255. Didn't come out because we need to change it to 225. So go ahead and make this 225. Run it. Step over it. Step over it. Step over it. Now we're in that if statement. Ready? Step over it. Our code is working. Step over it. There you go. So that's how we use the debugger. Alright. We also have the concept of breakpoints. So we can pause our code with breakpoints. And all we have to do is open the Sources tab, open the file containing the line of code that you want to break on, go to the line of code. To the left of the line of code is a number column. Click on it and a blue icon appears, and on top of the line number, just go ahead and turn on the debugger. So we can go back to that W3 Schools example. Open this up, go to the Sources tab, and the line that we want to stop on, let's go ahead and just run this. We'll choose this to be our breakpoint, right? And now if we run this, if we run it again, here we are at a breakpoint, right? This is the breakpoint that we're trying to catch. And you can look at the watch here, nothing's there, right? No global variables. So we open this up, here's our global variables listed, here's our script. So this is a way for us to add a breakpoint. We looked at watch, and who can tell me what the call stack is?
It's the queue of operations that are going in order.
Yep. So when you think of a call stack, let's bring this over here. We have a function, just create it. We have a function that's created. And then the function gets placed onto a stack. Now within this function is another function. So that gets placed onto the stack. And then there's another function inside of this. So that gets placed onto the stack. So in here is the main function. And then this calls the secondary function. And then this calls the third function. And then on the stack, the way that this is going to be executed is we have F1, we have F2, we have F3. The order of operations are going to be call this one first. So F3 gets called. Then this is going to return a value here. Then F2 gets called. And this is going to get returned here. Then F1 gets called. Okay. Do you see how that works? All right. So the document object model. Now, the document object model is a way for us to read, write, and update the DOM in a way that will allow us to modify and change HTML elements. So the way for us to be able to use the DOM is to add or remove elements. So you may have seen, in the to-do example that I gave you guys, that there's a way to actually remove those elements from the page and add them to the page. Right? So let's take a look at the DOM here as an example. Everything starts at the root node, the document here, right? This is the root element, HTML. And from HTML extends head, body, and then we have things like title, right? This is in the head. Within the body, we have our HTML elements like the H1 and A tag, and attributes off of these elements. So here's the separation, right? This is the head, and the head has things like a title. That title has a property called text, which is an attribute. And then we have the body. The body has elements, and those elements have attributes associated with them, and that's how we can, modify these parts of the DOM, right? Okay. So what is the DOM? The DOM defines a standard for accessing documents. The W3C document object model DOM is a platform and language neutral interface that allows programs and scripts to dynamically access and update the content, structure, and style of a document. So JavaScript can be used to read, write, and update the HTML document. And it has an object-oriented presentation, right? The objects that we're dealing with here are HTML elements, right? They're elements that we are using to create our page. It's a way for us to interact with the page. We also have the window object. So the window object represents an open window in the browser. If a document contains frames, like iframes, the browser creates one window object for the HTML document and one additional window object for each frame. Here are a couple properties that we have off of the window object. Most important one is going to be the DOM. So this is the document object, right? Takes us right back to where we were looking, right? We can get the URL, all these sort of things off of it. Very, very important. Then we have the HTML collection. So if we go to the HTML collection, an HTML collection is an array-like collection. It's a list of HTML elements. So the length property on this element will return the number of elements in that collection. So here's an example here, right? We have the document.getElementBy tag name. And then we have elements.getElement by tag name, and then we can get the elements.length. So what this is going to do is it's going to return the length of that HTML element. Right here we're fetching the elements that have that tag name of P, and here we're setting the inner HTML of the HTML element that has the ID demo to elements.length. Right? And the number of elements that we can fetch with a P tag here are 2. Now we have the node list, okay? So an HTML node list. A node list is an array-like collection of node objects. So we have a node list here, which is a document. We can fetch the node list by using document.querySelector, all with a P tag. And then if we run this example, this will actually allow us to print out the inner HTML from everything that's been selected with a p tag. So here we're fetching the element by the ID demo, and then we're setting the inner HTML of that element with the ID demo to the inner HTML the second paragraph is. So if you look over here, right, we have the inner HTML the second paragraph is hello Norway. Right? How does this work? So we have a document.Reselector, and that returns this node list, and then we're setting the node list on 1 to be the inner HTML from the second paragraph. Does that make sense? Okay. Alright, now we'll look at the array from. So the array from is a static method that creates a new shallow copy array instance from an array like or iterable object. So this allows us to copy one array from another, or an iterable object. So it can be a map, it could be an array, it doesn't necessarily have to be an array, it's something that is iterable. What does iterable mean?
You can call it over and over again.
Mm-hmm. More specifically?
You use increments, like you increment through the, let's say you're trying to get through the word home, so it's going to keep going. When you say it's iterable, that means it's going to go through each letter in the word home.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So something that's iterable would be an array. And then there's also iterable objects such as a map or a set. So we look at a map example here. Here's a map. The map has a key and a value. So when we set the key to this value, that sets up the map. Okay, so we run this. This is going to print out 1 for the first one because we're getting A here, and then we're getting the value for that, which is 1. And then B here. Yep. So we're getting A here, right? map1.getA, right? That returns 1, and we're logging it out after we've set it, after we've changed it. That's how that works. Okay, so document object model continued, right? Let's go ahead and have someone just go ahead and share your screen, and we can go ahead and go back to the example from yesterday, right? Where we have the first link.
Okay, so the root node of the HTML document is HTML DOM. Wait, what am I doing?
So the root node is just the document object.
Oh, okay, document object, yes. Let me see. Oh, yeah, okay. So the array-like collection list of HTML element is the HTML collection. The static method creates a new shallow copy array instance from an array-like or iterable object is the array.from. An array-like collection list of HTML elements is HTML collection. An array-like collection list of node objects is the HTML DOM.
Nice. All right. How do you feel?
Feel good.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Keep going through this. So, as you saw, we have the window object, and we have the document. From the document, you can get to a form or an anchor or a link. And then from the form, we have a text area, checkbox, radio, select, reset, button, option, all sorts of things. So these are the elements we have, and then these are the elements we have below that we can use. So here are the methods that we want to pay attention to the most in JavaScript for using the document. We have document.head. So the head is a read-only property of the document interface and returns the head element of the current document. Right, so here we're calling document.head, setting it to a variable, and then logging out the head. And then here we are using a query selector to select the head element. It's an alternative way of doing it, right? We can use the query selector, or we could just use the document to get off of it. Now we have document.body. So the document.body property represents the body or frame set node of the current document, or null if no such element exists. So here's an example, right? We have the document.body.id. This returns the ID off of that. We can create a new body from that. We can do a document create element body. Here we're passing in the element that needs to be created and assigning it to a variable. Later on we can reference that variable here where we have a new body element.id, and we're setting that to new body element. We also have another example here, document.body equals a new body element. So reassigning this created element here will allow us to use it later on. Now we have document.getElementById. So the document method getElementById returns an element object representing the element whose ID property matches the specified string. Since element IDs are required to be unique if specified, they are a useful way to get access to a specified element quickly. If you need to get access to an element which doesn't have an ID, you can use a query selector to find the element using any selector. So here's an example, right? We can assign an element the result from document.getElementById. This will take the element that we're looking at and the ID parameter that we're passing in, and then assign it to the variable element. Okay? Now we have document.getElementsByClassName. So we can look at an example here. The document object and the getElementsByClassName method. So here we have the method being invoked on the document object. So getElementsByClassName, right? Example. And then here we have our collection 0, and we can set the inner HTML to hello world, right? So we have our collection, which is being assigned here. And then we have our inner HTML, and we're setting it to hello world. We can change this to something else like this is the collection this is the text being assigned to the collection. Here we go. This is the text being assigned to the collection, right? Now we have document.querySelector. So the document method for the query selector returns the first element within the document that matches the specified selector or group of selectors. If no matches are found, null is returned. So we have an element here, and then document.querySelector selectors, and we go down to the bottom of the page here, right? Here's where we're using the selector. Trying to find the first div. So this query selector is using a regular expression, which is using an ID, foo, and then bar. So the first case, if we go up here, we have foo bar. This is going to select foo bar. Right, that's what this regular expression means. This doesn't match anything. This will match the second div. So this is how we can use regular expressions to do that. More frequently, you'll see it used with the class. Right, we can use the query selector to select the class. It's more frequent sort of usage that you'll find. We saw yesterday that there's a way for us to get the attribute off of the element that we're using. We can use an input name equal login. This is another way for us to select an object. Okay. And then we have document.querySelector all. So the document method querySelector all returns a static, not live node list representing a list of the document's elements that match the specified group of selectors. So we have an element list, and then we have a parent node, and then we have a querySelector all, which will match all of the selectors. Right. So we saw the querySelector all. We can grab a p tag, so we can do this. Then we can use querySelector.all to get an element and get its class, and that will allow us to set it to a variable. Okay. Alright. So we can go ahead and share the screen here. We'll work through the next set of key terms and descriptions.
Returns the first element within the document that matches the specified selector or selectors. Last name.
So document query.
Returns an element object representing the element whose ID property matches the specified string.
Or get element by ID.
Returns a static, not live node list representing a list of documents elements that match a specified group of selectors.
Query selector all.
Property returns the first child node of note. And returns a collection of elements with a specified class name.
All right. Nice. How do you feel?
Trying to absorb as much as I can. I'm still stuck on some stuff, so I haven't figured it out. So I'm kind of just trying to figure something else out before I try to grasp with something new.
Okay. Joe. All right. So now we'll go over child nodes. So we have this concept of a child node. And the child node property returns a collection or a list of an element's child nodes. So the child nodes property returns a node list object. We can go ahead and run this example here. So here we have the node list, and then we have a document.body.childNodes. And then here we're setting the text equal to null, right? Just an empty string. And then for each element in this node list, what we'll do is we will update the text with the node list node name, and then add a new line to the end of that. So if we look at this, the document.body.childNodes for this page, right? Let's see what we got here. An H1, an H2, a P, a P, a P. Right? So here we have each one of those nodes being called out. Why don't we go ahead and add something else here? So we can add something like a paragraph, and we'll call this leave an ID, and we'll call this the About Me section. Close it, and then we'll add another paragraph, ID, About Us section. Now if we run this, we have more text showing up. So we can remove this new line here, and we could turn this into something like a bracket. Put a space here, put a space here, grab the bracket, put it in front of all of this, run it. Now we can see this node list, right? Then we can add an arrow after this. This shows you how things are connected. As you can see here, it starts with the node list node. We get text, comment, text, and then the H1, then text, then the H2, and text, text, right? This is how this works, right? We're getting the text here. So we could update all the even ones using a conditional. This will give us all of the even nodes. We could do the odds. This gives us the elements in common. Okay. Now we'll look at children. So the children property returns a collection of an element's child elements. The children property returns an HTML collection object. So HTML nodes versus elements. In the HTML DOM, the document object model, an HTML document is a collection of nodes with or without child nodes. Nodes are element nodes, text nodes, and comment nodes. And white space between elements are also nodes. Elements are only element nodes. And the concept of child nodes versus children. So child nodes returns a child node. Children returns child elements. And then we have sibling versus siblings. So siblings versus element siblings. Siblings are brothers and sisters. Siblings are nodes with the same parent in the same node list. Element siblings are elements with the same parent. So conceptually, we think of these as like a family of elements. And we can try this example here. So in this example, we have a collection that's being created by getting the document.body.children. Then we have the text that's being created. This text is being created with an empty string, and then we're looping through, and each one of these we're pulling off the collection.tag name, and then we're adding a new line, right? So this is one way for us to get the new line. And again, here we could do something like I mod2 equals 0, and we can run this. This just gives us the h1, the p tag, and then the script tag. We do not equal, and that will give us this. Okay. Then we have the concept of first child. So the first child property returns the first child node of a node. It returns a node object. The property is read only. The first child property is the same as child node 0. Go ahead and run an example here. So in this case, we have the element object in the first child property. It's the h2s that we have set here. And then here we have the document.getElementById my list, which is this list right here. And then we're getting the first child, the inner HTML. So the first child will be copied, then we're getting the inner HTML. Then we're going to go to the document again, and then we're going to get the element that has the ID demo. We're going to update the text to be that node. So we could change this again. We could change this to second child. Or we could do children. Zero. Coffee. 1. Tea. So you can use this to access different parts of the document. There we go. The coffee. Then we have first child element. So the first child element property returns the first child element of the specified element. The first element child property is read only, and the first element child property returns the same as children 0. You can go ahead and run this. So the first element child is going to be coffee here, right? That's the inner HTML. And then we can set it to the demo here. We can set the demo to text. On that. And then we have last child. So the last child property returns the last child node of a node. We can go ahead and run this. Here we have an example, right? The HTML content of the list last child node is whatever is added to the demo. So here we have the document.getElementById demo, and inner HTML, and then we're getting the text from what's returned from the last child. So the last child here is T. We can change this to first child. Goes back to coffee. The last child goes back to T. Alright. So now we can go to the last element child.
I'm doing good.
So
It's today.
the last child.
Thank you. We're going to get
The
started.
last child. The last element child is away from
Thank you.
the last element in this list. I'm going to go ahead and run an example. So here we are using the document again and getting element by ID in my list, which is the element UL up here, and the ID is my list. And then we're doing the document.getElementById demo here, and we're setting the HTML to be the last element child of that image, which comes out to be 2. Okay. So we can go to the last section here, right? The child element count property returns the number of child elements of an element. So if we run this one here, what we have is the child element count, and then we're setting that to the variable num, and then we're updating the inner HTML of the element that has the ID demo right here. So this is what we're fetching the child element count, and then we are setting the text inside the demo to be 2. So that's how that works. Just run that. So we can go ahead and share the screen. We'll go through the next set of exercises.
Okay, so. Oh, did someone else?
No, you can go. I was trying to fix my.
Okay. The property returns the last child node of a node. Should be the last child. And property returns the parent node of an element or node. Would be that one. Property returns the next node on the same tree level. Would be the next sibling. Property returns the next element in the same tree level as the next element sibling. And then property returns the first child element of this specified element. It's going to be the first child.
Okay. Good job. So now we'll go into the parent node object. The parent node property returns the parent node of an element or node. The parent node property is read only, so we can go ahead and run this. So here we have the node name of the parent node myLi, which comes out to be UL. So if you look at this, we have the document.getElementById myLi. And then we have the parent node, and then we're getting the node name. And the node name for that is going to be a UL. And that's what we're setting this here. So here's the parent element property. So we can get the node name of the parent element of an LI element, right? And this is an example, right? The parent element property returns the parent element of the specified element. The difference between parent element and parent node is that parent element returns null if the parent node is not a element node. So we're going to run this. So in this example, right, we have my function, and this function is using the document, and then .getElementById, myLI.parentElement.nodeName. We're setting that to the variable x, and then here we're taking the value from that and setting that to the inner HTML for demo. This is just a way for us to use the parent element.nodeName. Now we have next sibling. So the next sibling property returns the next node on the same tree level. The next sibling returns a node object. The next sibling property is read only. Go ahead and try this demo here. So in this example, we have the document, and then we're getting element by ID, item 1, and then the next sibling.innerHTML, and setting that to the text variable. So this is using the next sibling.innerHTML. If you look at the code here, right, the HTML content of the next sibling of the first list item is T. It's the second item. So that's the next sibling from item 1. Item 1, item 2 is the next sibling. We can go ahead and add another example here. Call this item 3, water. And this is our third item. And we can go ahead and change this to item 2 and none. So this will return the third item, which is water. We do 1, we do 2, we do 3. Nothing there, right? That's how that works. Alright. Now we can get the siblings of siblings, so we can use the previous sibling. So the previous sibling property returns the previous node on the same tree level. The previous sibling property returns a node object. The previous sibling property is read only. So we go ahead and run this. Here we have the element object in the H1. This is the definition of what we're dealing with here, right? The element object. And here we're getting the previous sibling of item 2. So item 2 is right here. The previous sibling is coffee. That's what's going to be returned when we set the inner HTML of demo. We can go ahead and try this again. We create an LI. We create an ID. We can set the ID equal to item 2 here, and then take this, we'll go ahead and put it in here, we'll close off that tag with an LI, and then we'll go ahead and make this into 3, and then we'll go ahead and turn this into water, and then we'll go ahead and make this into third item. Okay, so here we'll go ahead and put this as item 3, and then we should get back T. Right now, we could turn this into 1, and run it, we'll get nothing back. We'll go ahead and copy this and turn this into another LI. right here, and we'll turn this into item 4, and we'll call this juice. Make this into 4th item, and then we'll take this as 4th. 1. This returns the third item 1. Okay. Alright, now we have previous element sibling. So the previous element sibling property returns the previous element in the same tree level. And go ahead and run this. Alright, so the element object, again, is what we're looking at. We have the previous element sibling. And this property is going to be the previous element sibling. So in this case, we have item 2, and the previous element sibling is going to be item 1. Okay? And so that's going to return coffee here. Alright. So now we have the ability to create elements. We can use document.createElement. So the document.createElement here, go down here. What this is doing is calling the document object, and then we're calling the createElement method on here with div, and then that's going to create a new div, which is going to get assigned this variable, and then we can give it content. This will allow us to create a div with content is a way for us to use JavaScript. So we can go ahead and copy this code. We'll open up VS Code. Make this larger. And we'll go ahead and add a week 4 module. This file to be Createelement module. So we'll have this, and then we'll put in our script. Go back to our example. We'll grab our function. In here we'll add tabs. Do this like this. So what this is going to do is it's going to call the method addElement, which is defined here. And then we'll tab this in. AddElement is going to create a div, and then it'll add text to the text node, which will say, hi there, in greetings. Then it will append this new content to the div that we've created. And then we'll add the newly created element and its content into the DOM. Right? And then we'll use the insert before to add the new div, and then add the current div. So we can right click on this, reveal in Finder, open this up. Here we have hi there and greetings. We can inspect this. So we have div1, the text above was created dynamically, which is this div. Hi there and greetings. Back to Visual Studio Code. So So here we're creating the div, then we're updating the content, adding the content to the div, and then fetching the div 1, and then inserting the new div before that current div. So this current div allows us to fetch that new div. Right, so we're putting the content before that. Now we have class name. So the class name property of the element interface gets and sets the value of the class attribute of the specified element. So in this case, we have the C name, which comes from the element node reference class name, and the element node reference class name is from C name. Here's an example. We can set the element here after we fetch the element from the HTML by the ID item, and then if the element class name equals active, then we'll set it to inactive. If it's not active, then we'll set it to active. This is a way for us to toggle this property. So this is a way for us to go ahead and toggle the property. Then we have HTML DOM element ID. So the ID property sets or returns the value of an element's ID attribute. If we go ahead and run this, here we have the HTML, and then here we have our script. And so the document.getElementsBy tag name, we can go ahead and get it by the tag name, and then the first element off that, and the ID off of that, and then we can set that to be the inner HTML demo, which comes out to be my anchor 1. Why don't we go ahead and try this with 1? We can run that. We can try this with 2. We can run that. Alright, let's go ahead and copy this, and we'll go ahead and put it into our modules. So I have this here. We'll call this one element by ID module. Right. Now we have set attribute. So the set attribute method sets the value of an attribute on a specified element. If the attribute value already exists, the value is updated. Otherwise, a new attribute is added with a specified name and value. To get the current value of an attribute, use the get attribute to remove an attribute. Call remove attribute. Okay. So here's an example. We have the HTML button hello world, and then we have our JavaScript, and what this is doing is this is a query selector to select a button, and then it's going to set the attribute name on the button to hello button, and it's going to set the attribute disabled on that button as well. Okay. Then we have get attribute. So the HTML DOM element get attribute, right? You can get the value of the class attribute of an element. So we can run this, and this example allows us to get the attribute from this element. So here we have document.getElementById, my h1, and then we have element.getAttribute class. So here we're looking for the attribute class, which is going to have the value of demo class, and we can set the text. So we can go ahead and grab this module, add it here, and we'll get attribute.html. What we can do is we can change this to something like my class. Save this, and then reveal in Finder. and open this up. And this returns my class. So this get attribute allows us to get a class name. We could try something else. We go ahead and add an A tag. And we'll set that at the href attribute to be www.google.com. Save that, and then here we'll go ahead and specify href. Save it. Go back here to the page. So the issue here is that we need to have an ID. So we'll call this my A tag. Google.com. Okay. Now we can use the remove attribute. So remove the class attribute from the H1 element. In this case, we're removing an attribute from the HTML element. So likewise, we can grab this code, and what this is doing is it's finding the element by the tag name H1 and then calling remove attribute class off of that. So you can use this to toggle a class. Go back here, by module, and we'll call this remove attribute. So we can use this to toggle, right? Something. So we have my function here, and then we can remove the attribute class conditionally. We can change it just to on mouse, enter. Back here. Let's wait for us to toggle the class. Then we have has attribute. So the has attribute returns true if the attribute exists, otherwise returns false. So I'm looking at an example here. Does the button have an on-click attribute? So it checks here, it checks to see on-click, and yes it does, and so therefore it's going to return true. Right? So we have the document.getElementById, my button, and we return this, and then we go to the answer, we do my button has attribute on click, so if it does, it'll return this. So you can grab this, go back to VS Code, create a new file, and we'll call this as attribute module.html. Okay, we save that, and here's an example, right? We can go ahead and remove the attribute here from on click to mouse, on mouse, on mouse, enter, save it, and then you need to review and finder. So it doesn't, right? Nothing happens. We can combine these modules, right? We can do remove attribute has attribute module of HTML. And we'll go ahead and grab the remove attribute and put it in here. And then we'll go to the has attribute. That is. Go ahead and put this in here. And so the HTML that we need is going to be this HTML. So we're going to grab this and we'll put it in here. Then we won't need any of this. This JavaScript code. Get rid of this. Just make sure you have the body closing tag. Okay. So this body opens here, the body closes here, and we go ahead and JavaScript here. So we have my button with this ID, and then once that's clicked, it will change the value to the value from my button. So it's going to check to see what my button is, and if that button's been clicked, then it'll change the answer. It'll change the text of the demo the demo HTML to the answer. We also have this function called myFunction, which is defined twice. So go ahead and fix this on mouse enter. And what we can do here, we can remove the attribute class from here. Demo class. Put an if statement in. If the button, if this button has this attribute, which is a boolean, if my button has that, then we can remove the attribute demo class. So this is a way for us to check to make sure that we have the onClick function defined for my button. So we need to set this up here. And the button ID here, we can move this up here. And we can get rid of this. Get rid of this. And what should happen is when we mouse over, it'll check this. In do the demo.html. So we can say document.getElementById demo, and then we can set the inner HTML equal to so we'll have an else statement here. Else. Move this up. Here is the onClick attribute does not exist on the button. Save this. So if this, and then this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, go ahead and get rid of this. And then replace this variables here. Alright, now we'll go ahead and reveal this in public. So So this says the onClick attribute does not exist for the button. Okay. And go back to the code here, and we can change this to onClick.
Like, I'm really, so I know just in general.
Refresh the page. So on click, we want to find the H1 and remove the attribute demo class. So elements by tag name, H1, demo class, remove class. If my button has an on click attribute, then remove it. So refresh this. And open the debugger. So we've been back to the console. So
Is it because the H1 is in capital letters?
This should still print out the H1 here. This is actually a great example of where we can use the get attribute we're going to get attribute here. So you go to get attribute dot get elements by tag name H1. Remove demo class. So here's one way to start debugging this. Go ahead and just grab this, and then go to the console, paste it in, and if we run this, this shows us demo class H1. So this should have the demo class H1. So if my button has attribute on click, this function should execute. So we put a log statement in here. Save it, put a semicolon at the end. And run it. Let's make it to line 24. Remove attribute class. Save it. Back here. There we go. So it's removing the class attribute. So it's about 5:37 here, so why don't we take we'll take a longer break than usual, and we'll use this time to do an exercise. If you guys can go ahead, and what I'd like for us to kind of practice is creating a toggling class. So the goal for this project is to create a site that allows you to toggle something on and off. This could be as elaborate as you want. We're going to take about an hour here to go through and do this. The goal is to create something that allows you to toggle interactively with JavaScript. This could be something like flipping a card, it could be something like flipping a page, or just showing how to turn on and off a simulation of an LED. Take a full hour here, and we'll just go through using what we just covered to discuss toggling on and off and using JavaScript to create interactivity in the page.